There's a lot of misunderstanding about evolution, about science really, in the creation science literature, one of the most pervasive being the equation of natural forces with chance and randomness. Nature is chance, it's chaotic, it's random. Design, God, is directed, organized, squared away. When you see the really quite complicated things that you often do see in biological organisms, many Americans just sort of naturally say, oh, well, of course, there's no way to explain that by random chance processes. And every evolutionary biologist would agree with you that something like a bacteria flagellum could not possibly have been assembled by random amino acids or proteins falling together to form this functioning structure. Everyone would agree with that. The error lies much deeper. The error lies in equating any natural process with chance. And of course, Charles Darwin's great discovery was that the process of natural selection is a natural process that generates complex structures. It is a natural process, but it is not a chance process. Don't ever let anybody ever tell you natural selection is a chance process. It isn't. It's adaptive differential reproduction, and you can ask your biology professor what that means, because I don't have time to talk about everything. One of the common threads that you find in creation science is that there's some sort of systematic difference between macroevolution, by which they mean common ancestry, and microevolution, by which they mean natural selection and these other mechanisms that work at the species or kind level, created kind if you're a creationist. And a very common position in creation science and evidence against evolution is the idea that the Earth is simply too young for evolution to have occurred. That last is something that's left out of intelligent design, but I'll get to there in a moment. Now, creation science was and remains an active political and social movement, but it remains fundamentally a religious position wrapped up in science. During the 1970s and 80s, there were many efforts made to get creation science taught in local school districts, and also to try to get laws passed in states requiring the teaching of creation science if evolution were taught. In Arkansas Law 590 was passed in 1981, which required that if evolution were taught, it had to be balanced by the teaching of creation science. The Arkansas Bill 590 was challenged immediately by a group of plaintiffs, and the plaintiffs in the McLean versus Arkansas case, to many people's surprise, were the religious leaders of a large number of Protestant and of Christian denominations. These included the Presbyterians. Bill McLean, the lead plaintiff, was a Presbyterian minister. The United Methodists, the Episcopals, the Catholic, the African Methodist Episcopal, and the Southern Baptists. They've changed since. But all these religious organizations were against the teaching of creation science, and that made a lot of people scratch their heads until they realized that creation science was promoting a very specific religious view. It was not promoting the idea that, well, God had something to do with it. It was promoting the very specific special creationist view of biblical literalism. And all these denominations were not literalist in their theology, and so they did not want the schools teaching a theology that they didn't agree with Monday through Friday and then have to straighten the kids out on Saturday and Sunday. So the key plaintiffs in McLean versus Arkansas were religious leaders, and they were joined by parents and educators as well. McLean was a fascinating experience. It was a full trial. A very distinguished group of evolutionary biologists and geologists and physicists, chemists I mean, presented very good evidence for why creation science did not meet the tenets of science and why the fact claims that creation science made, such as the world being 10,000 years old and such as the Grand Canyon being cut by Noah's flood and things like that, were just rubbish as far as science was concerned. Whatever your religious beliefs, creation science was not science. On the other side were a series of not nearly as well-known scientists, in fact, scientists that most people had never heard of at all, and under the very skilled questioning of the plaintiff's attorneys, the defense, which was the pro-creationist side, was forced to admit some very embarrassing things on the witness stand because they had admitted them under deposition, such as that UFOs are the works of Satan. I mean, that's the kind of thing that kind of gets to your credibility and does not impress a judge a whole lot. Well, the defense utterly failed to convince the judge that creation science was scientific, and Judge John Overton ruled that the law in Arkansas was unconstitutional. Creation science was not science, and teaching it in the public schools violated the First Amendment. The full trial of McLean versus Arkansas, in which the creationists had their opportunity to present the best argument they had for why creation science was science. The plaintiffs had the best opportunity to present reasons why they thought it was not science. Turned out to be such a crushing defeat for the creationists that the state didn't even appeal. So this case remained at the district court level. Some of you are thinking about, gee, this sounds a whole lot like Kitzmiller versus Dover, if you've been following the recent intelligent design trial. And indeed, as this trial was going on and as we were preparing for it for the practically a full year, you know, McLean and Kitzmiller parallels just kept coming to mind. And of course, the fact that Kitzmiller was not appealed either is sort of one of the sad outcomes of that case. But I would urge you to read the decision in McLean. It was published in Science Magazine, and it's available online in many places, including our website, because it's a very, very wonderful history of the creation and evolution controversy and how creation science grows out of a fundamentally, no pun intended, religious position and is really just masquerading as science. Well, first there was the Arkansas equal time law, which was so well defeated, thoroughly defeated. But hot on its heels was a law passed in Louisiana, another equal time law, in fact, almost identical in wording to the Arkansas law. Science teacher Don Aguilard brought suit against the state of Louisiana. And there was not a full trial in this case. It was just done on summary judgments. But this is the case that got all the way to the Supreme Court. And in Edwards versus Aguilar, the Supreme Court judged that creation science was not science, leaning heavily on McLean. It was not science. It was unconstitutional to advocate it in the public schools. Now let's shift to where intelligent design comes in. Edwards versus Arkansas was decided in 1987, but it basically took a long time to work its way through the courts. Edwards started about in the early 1980s, which is the time that McLean was being decided. Also in the early 1980s, this man, John Buell, from a Christian ministry in Dallas called the Foundation for Thought and Ethics, was concerned, as were a number of other conservative Christians, that creation science wasn't making it. The McLean decision had been so very powerful, it looked like creation science was not likely to survive, although they kept their hopes up. But they began discussing an alternative to creation science that would maybe not make some of the same mistakes, like making fact claims about the age of the earth, which could be refuted by science, making fact claims about the effect of Noah's flood, which could be refuted through geological science. And so they were trying to come up with a form of creationism that would pass legal muster. Creation science wasn't getting very far with the courts, but it also wasn't getting very far with mainstream Christians. The biblical literalism, the young earth part just seemed a little bit wacky to most Christians who were perfectly happy with an ancient earth, and most of them were reasonably happy with theistic evolution. So part of the goal of this group of conservative Christians who gathered around John Buell in the early 1980s was to try to come up with something that would be more appealing to Christians across the board and would also withstand legal scrutiny. The movement that they began became intelligent design. But the first book that Thaxton's group produced was this book, The Mystery of Life's Origin. Now, this is a book on the origin of life. And it was published in 1984. And it is the first statement of what became intelligent design theory, although it did not use the phrase intelligent design. It did talk about intelligent agents and used a lot of the same language.